Hanyang 88, the rifle that outlived an empire, a revolution, and 3 wars. In 1937, as the Japanese army launched its full-scale invasion of China, a Chinese soldier held a defensive position on the outskirts of Shanghai. In his hands was a rifle already more than 40 years old. It was long, heavy, outdated by the standards of the time. Its design dated back to the 19th century when the Chinese Empire was struggling to catch up with the Western powers and build a modern army. But now, this old rifle was back on the front line. Beside him stood young soldiers of the Chinese National Army, armed with machine guns, mortars, and more modern weapons. Yet, in the hands of countless ordinary infantrymen was still the Hanyang 88, a weapon born in the days of the Qing Empire, a weapon that survived a revolution, a weapon that fought against the Japanese army, and a weapon that kept being used even after China itself had changed forever.
The story of the Hanyang 88 is not the story of the finest rifle ever made. It's the story of a country that spent decades trying to build a modern army amid endless wars, political chaos, and a chronic shortage of resources. It's the story of how a design copied from a foreign blueprint became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Chinese military in the first half of the 20th century. But to understand why this rifle came to exist, we need to go back to the closing years of the 19th century, when the Chinese Empire first came face to face with the reality of modern industrial warfare. In the mid-19th century, China was still one of the largest powers on Earth, but its army had fallen far behind those of Europe and Japan. Chinese troops still relied heavily on traditional weapons, old muskets, swords, spears, and outdated artillery, while European states were already moving to bolt-action rifles, smokeless powder, and industrial mass production of weapons.
Defeat in the First Opium War against Britain in 1840 to 1842 had already exposed the weakness of China's military system. But the real shock for Beijing came later. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out. China's opponent was Japan, a country that in just a few decades had carried out a sweeping modernization of its army after the Meiji Restoration. Japanese soldiers carried modern weapons and fought in a well-organized European-style force. The Chinese army was poorly prepared, and the gap in weaponry and organization showed immediately. The war ended in defeat for China. Under the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki, China lost its influence over Korea and ceded Taiwan to Japan. For the Qing government, this was undeniable proof that the old military order no longer worked. China needed a new army, and a new army needed a new rifle. Looking for a solution, China turned its attention to Europe, especially to Germany.
In the late 19th century, the German army had adopted a new rifle, the Gewehr 88. It emerged out of a European arms race triggered by the French Lebel rifle of 1886. France had been first to field a mass-issue rifle firing smokeless powder, giving its soldiers a huge advantage. Greater range, better accuracy, and no giveaway cloud of smoke after every shot. Germany answered with the Gewehr 88. It fired the new 7.92 by 57 mm smokeless cartridge, used a Mannlicher-style magazine system, and was designed by a German rifle commission. Although the Gewehr 88 was later overshadowed by the famous Mauser 98,
At the moment of its introduction, it was one of the most modern military rifles in the world. Chinese military planners saw in this design a chance to modernize their army quickly. But China didn't simply buy finished rifles from abroad. It chose a different path, building its own production capacity at home. That required a modern arms factory, and the place chosen for it was Hanyang. The city of Hanyang lay next to Wuhan, one of China's most important industrial regions. It was there in the late 19th century that the Hanyang Arsenal was built, meant to become the center of China's production of modern weapons. Construction began in 1890, backed by the self-strengthening movement, a reform effort aimed at absorbing Western technology without abandoning Chinese tradition. Chinese leaders understood a simple truth. A country cannot forever buy its weapons abroad. It has to learn to make them itself. After the defeat to Japan, the importance of the Hanyang Arsenal grew sharply. In 1895, the factory began producing rifles based on the German Gewehr 88. This rifle became known as the Hanyang Type 88. In China, simply the Hanyang 88, named for its place and model of manufacture. Production was no small task. Chinese industry at the time had little experience with the mass output of modern firearms. Workers had to master new skills from scratch: precision metalworking, barrel making, ammunition production, quality control. But step by step, the Hanyang Arsenal grew into one of China's largest weapons producers. The Hanyang 88 became the first truly mass-produced modern rifle in the Chinese army. At first glance, the Hanyang 88 looked like a typical late 19th century European rifle. A long wooden stock, a long barrel, an under-barrel magazine, a bayonet for close combat. But underneath, it marked an important step in the Chinese army's transition to modern arms. The Hanyang 88 fired the 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge, a powerful rifle round that later became the German army's standard. It held 5 rounds, loaded from a stripper clip inserted from above. Once emptied, the clip dropped out through an opening at the bottom of the magazine. Effective range depended on battlefield conditions, but like other rifles of its era, it was built to fire out to several hundred meters. Its length suited the massed infantry tactics of the day, but the design had its flaws, chiefly its ancestry. By the turn of the century, the German army itself had already moved on to the far superior Mauser 98, with a simpler, sturdier bolt built to handle heavier loads. Still, for China, the Hanyang 88 was an enormous leap forward from what had come before. It wasn't a perfect rifle, but it was a rifle of the modern age. By the early 1900s, the Hanyang 88 had become more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of China's attempt to build a modern military. The trouble was that this modern weapon had arrived in a country that was itself on the verge of collapse. By the turn of the century, the Qing dynasty had already lost much of its authority. Corruption within the government, military defeats, economic pressure from foreign powers, the rise of revolutionary movements, all of it was steadily tearing down the old order. The Qing army tried to reform. New units were formed and trained along European lines. Soldiers received new uniforms. Drills were conducted. And more often, the rifle in a Chinese infantryman's hands was the Hanyang 88. But not even the most modern rifle could solve the country's political problems. In 1911, the Wuchang Uprising ignited the Xinhai Revolution, the greatest political crisis in the history of the Qing dynasty. The first uprising broke out in Wuchang, literally next door to the Hanyang Arms Center. New army soldiers, many of them armed with modern rifles, rose up against the imperial government. It was one of the great ironies of the Hanyang 88. A weapon built to strengthen the Qing Empire ended up in the hands of the very people who helped destroy it. In the autumn of 1911, the Chinese Empire began to fall apart. The uprising spread across the provinces. Many military units defected to the revolutionaries. One of the key flashpoints was the Wuhan area, home to the Hanyang Arsenal itself, and control of the arsenal meant control of rifle and ammunition production. During the fighting over Wuhan, Hanyang 88 rifles were used by both imperial troops and revolutionary forces alike. A weapon built to defend the Qing state had become the weapon of the Chinese Republic's birth. In February 1912, Puyi, the last emperor of China, abdicated the throne. In place of a centuries-old empire stood a new republic. But the founding of the republic brought no peace, quite the opposite. China entered a period of deep political instability. The central government was weak, and regional warlords began building armies of their own. The age of the warlords had begun. And it was in this era that the Hanyang 88 found its second life. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, China fractured among competing military factions, each commander wanting an army of his own. The real problem was supply. The great powers could produce millions of rifles. China had only a handful of modern factories, so weapons were kept in service for decades. The Hanyang 88 was perfectly suited to this reality. It was reliable enough. Its ammunition was made domestically. Chinese armorers already knew the design inside and out. And there was already a vast infrastructure for producing and repairing it. It became one of the most common rifles in Chinese armies of the 1910s and 1920s, carried by the forces of regional military governors, by troops of the Republic, by local militias, and in part by revolutionary units as well. China at this point was a country where dozens of different armies could exist side by side, some carrying German Mausers, others Japanese Arisakas, others older European systems entirely. But the Hanyang 88 remained one of the most recognizable of them all. In the 1920s, a new force emerged, the National Revolutionary Army of the Kuomintang. After establishing its government in Guangzhou, the party began preparing to unify China, and its central effort was the Northern Expedition of 1926 to 1928, a sweeping campaign against the northern warlords. Kuomintang troops pushed through central and eastern China. Photographs from this period showed Chinese soldiers carrying all kinds of weapons, and among them the Hanyang 88. By world standards, it was already outdated, but for the Chinese army, it still mattered enormously. The reason was simple. War doesn't demand the most modern weapon, it demands the weapon that's actually available. And the Hanyang 88 was available in vast numbers. By the 1920s, many of these rifles had already seen 10 or even 20 years of service. Some had passed through several armies. Some had survived a revolution. Some had been carried by more than one generation of soldiers. The leadership of the Republic understood the problem. The world was moving on. Europe's armies were already switching to more advanced rifles. Even Germany itself had moved to the Mauser 98K after the First World War. China needed something newer. One answer was the Chiang Kai-shek rifle, built on the German Mauser 98 design. Unlike the Hanyang 88, it used the far more modern Mauser bolt action, shorter, sturdier, better suited to 20th century warfare. In the 1930s, China began building it in earnest. But there was a huge obstacle: the sheer number of Hanyang 88s already in service. Replacing millions of old rifles was practically impossible. China simply lacked the industrial base of Germany or the United States. So even after the new design appeared, the Hanyang 88 stayed in the ranks. It became a rifle of the in-between years, too old to be modern, but too numerous to disappear. In 1937, full-scale war broke out between China and Japan, and the Hanyang 88 found itself back at the center of history. Japan fielded one of the most modern armies in Asia. Its soldiers carried the Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99 rifles, and Japanese industry could turn out weapons in large numbers. China was in a far harder position. The country was divided, its industry limited, most of its arms production scattered in small batches. So the old Hanyang 88 stayed in the hands of Chinese infantry. Through the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, through the defense of Wuhan in 1938, and through countless engagements across the war that followed. For many Chinese soldiers, it was the only rifle they had ever held. Heavy, long, hopelessly outdated, but it fired, and in wartime, that mattered more than almost anything else. When Japan launched its full invasion in 1937, China found itself in a situation it had spent decades preparing for and never quite solved. It needed a modern, unified army, but instead it had a patchwork of different eras. Some units carried German Mausers, some had Czech machine guns, some carried American weapons that arrived later through aid programs, and many ordinary soldiers still carried the Hanyang 88, a rifle older by this point than many of the men who fought with it. It had come into being under Emperor Guangxu. It had outlived the fall of the Qing dynasty. It had passed through the age of the warlords. Now it was about to face one of the most prepared armies in the world. One of the first great tests came at the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, one of the largest engagements of the Second World War in Asia. Chinese commanders understood the city's strategic weight. Shanghai was China's largest industrial and financial center, and its capture would give Japan a crucial staging ground for further advances. The best units of the National Revolutionary Army were sent to defend it. Some elite Chinese formations were well trained and equipped with German weapons, but a large share of the army still carried older rifles, including the Hanyang 88. In the close confines of urban combat, its weaknesses mattered less. Its long barrel and powerful cartridge had been designed for open ground and long range. But amid ruined buildings, city streets, and makeshift fortifications, what a soldier usually needed was simply a rifle he could trust. The Hanyang 88 delivered that. It let Chinese soldiers trade fire on equal footing with an enemy that otherwise had a far stronger industrial base. Of course, it couldn't change the overall balance of power. Japan held the advantage in aircraft, artillery, supply, and training. After 3 months of brutal fighting, Chinese forces were forced to abandon Shanghai. But the battle proved something important. The old rifle was still a fighting weapon. In 1938, the Japanese offensive continued, and its next major target was Wuhan. For the Hanyang 88, this had special meaning. The Hanyang Arsenal, where the rifle had been born more than 40 years earlier, stood right next door. Now, soldiers carrying that same rifle were defending the region against the Japanese advance. The Battle of Wuhan became one of the largest engagements of the war, lasting several months. the Chinese army threw everything it had into the fight. Hanyang 88 rifles, German Mausers, machine guns, artillery, foreign-made weapons of every kind. Japan eventually took the city, but the Chinese army was not destroyed. It kept fighting, and the Hanyang 88 kept serving. At first, it might seem strange that China kept fielding a 19th century rifle deep into 20th century wars. The answer wasn't in the rifle's specifications, it was in the industry behind it. Building weapons isn't just about designing something new. It means producing millions of parts, barrels, bolts, cartridges, spares, training soldiers, and training armorers. Germany could replace its old rifles because it had a powerful industrial base. The United States could mass-produce new designs with ease. China was in a completely different position. Decades of internal conflict had gutted its economy, and its production capacity stayed limited. Every working rifle counted. That's exactly why the Hanyang 88 became an example of a weapon that outlived its own era. It was no longer the best, but it was available, and available weapons often shape history more than perfect ones that never arrive in sufficient numbers. Once the war with Japan began, keeping up production became even harder. The Hanyang Arsenal itself came under direct threat. As Japanese forces closed in on China's industrial centers, the government began relocating factories deeper into the interior, a massive logistical undertaking involving machinery, skilled workers, and raw materials, all moved across a country already at war. Weapons production grew far more difficult. Some factories were destroyed, some were evacuated. Some kept operating under severely limited conditions. China increasingly came to depend on foreign shipments. After the United States entered the war, China began receiving Allied aid, rifles, machine guns, and other equipment. But even then, the Hanyang 88 didn't vanish. Too many of them already sat in depots and in the hands of active units. In 1945, Japan surrendered, and China found itself among the victorious powers. But peace didn't bring stability. Instead of a war against a foreign enemy, a new internal struggle erupted: the Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party resumed at full scale. And once again, old rifles went back to the front. Soldiers on both sides carried an enormous mix of weapons: captured Japanese Arisakas, American rifles, Soviet arms, German Mausers, and Chinese Hanyang 88s. The Hanyang 88 mattered most to units that had no access to modern arms. It was familiar. Ammunition for it still existed. Soldiers knew how to repair it. It kept doing its one essential job: putting a bullet where a soldier needed it to go. In 1949, the Civil War ended in communist victory, and the People's Republic of China was established on the mainland. The new army began a sweeping overhaul, turning increasingly toward the Soviet Union for its weapons. Soviet Mosin Nagant rifles became one of its primary arms, and China later began producing its own versions of Soviet-designed automatic rifles. The age of the bolt-action rifle was drawing to a close. The Hanyang 88 was finally, truly obsolete. But its story wasn't quite over. Some copies stayed in reserve units, some sat in storage, some ended up with local militias. It had traveled an extraordinary road, born under an imperial dynasty, carried by revolutionaries, serving the Republican Army, fighting Japan, fighting through a civil war. Very few weapon systems can claim a service record that long. Today, the Hanyang 88 holds a distinct place among historic firearms. It wasn't the most accurate rifle of the 19th century.
It wasn't the most powerful. It never became a world standard the way the Mauser 98 did. Its significance lies elsewhere. It was China's first mass attempt at building a modern military weapon. It proved Chinese industry could produce complex military hardware. It bore witness to China's passage from empire to republic, from a patchwork of regional armies toward the pursuit of a unified national force, from the old 19th century world into the industrial wars of the 20th. Most rifles fade from history. They're replaced by newer models, forgotten in storerooms somewhere. But a few weapons become part of a nation's memory, and the Hanyang 88 is one of them. It was born out of weakness, but used through struggle. It began as a foreign design, but became a Chinese symbol. It was outdated, yet it kept serving because it was needed. Its story illustrates a broader truth about military history. The best weapon isn't always the most modern one. Sometimes, what matters most is simply the weapon a soldier has in hand the moment the war begins. The Hanyang 88 began its life as China's attempt to catch up with the industrial powers of its age. It emerged out of military defeat and reform. It was built on a German design, yet it carved out its own distinctly Chinese history. It outlived the fall of the Qing Empire. It passed through revolutions and civil wars. It fought the Japanese army, and it remained in service even as the world was already moving on to automatic weapons. Today, this rifle is a reminder of more than just a piece of hardware. It's a reminder of an era when China was searching for its place among the modern nations of the world. The Hanyang 88 was never a perfect rifle, but it was the rifle of an age of transformation. And that's exactly why, more than 100 years later, it remains one of the most compelling weapons in Chinese history.